go beyond sensational with some special guests to give us insight into Spider-Man's creation and origins. Welcome to writer of Amazing Spider-Man from 1981 to 2012, including Kraven's Last Hunt and the new Ben Reilly Spider-Man series, J.M. DeMatteis. Hey, J.M.
Hey, how are you?
Good to have you. Former Spider-Man editor and former co-executive producer of the Spider-Man animated series, my old boss, Steve Wacker. Hi.
Hey, everybody.
And VP and executive editor, Tom Brevoort. Hey, Tom.
Hey, Lorraine, how you doing?
I'm great. Thank you all for joining me. Now, we are going to be looking into the legacy of Spider-Man into the early days to his origins. For each of you, what personally was the most meaningful or impactful thing about those original Spider-Man comics from Stan Lee and Steve Ditko? Jam, why don't you kick us off?
You know, the first Spider-Man comic I remember seeing was a really, really early one. And I was used to the finely sculpted, pristine, somewhat sterile comics from the distinguished competition. And I thought Spider-Man was a horror comic because I had never seen anything like Steve Ditko's work. Spider-Man, if you look at those old comics especially, is very creepy. And in fact, as a kid at that age, it was a little too creepy for me. So I had to kind of back away from it. I wasn't ready for it. But then a few years later, I jumped on right when John Romita took over the book and then went back and reread all those original stories. But I think the essence of Spider-Man was right there in that first Romita story that I read, which is you had a huge story on one level with the Green Goblin, with Peter Parker, but the stakes weren't about the world. The stakes were all personal. It was about Peter Parker. It was about Norman Osborn. It was about Harry Osborn. It was about their families. And Spider-Man has always been a profoundly personal character, rooted in really emotional stories of some psychological depth. And that's what I responded to as a kid, and that's what I respond to as a writer.
Yeah, I really think we all do. Steve, how about you?
Mark, you're so right about those early stories being darker, I think, than sometimes people give them credit for it. When I was editing the book, people all the time would say, we were going too dark on Spidey, and the criticisms. In my mind, I mean, there's a murder in the very first Spider-Man story, and it changes Peter's life in a dramatic way, and it haunted me a long time up through your work for sure. I think one of the things that resonated with me beyond that, obviously his power set as a kid is just amazingly cool and fun. And there are Ditko and Romita poses that we all still make today that just are completely bound into the character. I think one of the things that really resonated with me with the book also was the fact that he was young, which was unusual for a hero not to be a teenager but not to be a sidekick. Was certainly different in 1962 with the rise of teens just as a demographic. But also the fact that his Aunt May was still around. She is such a key part of the story, and she sort of broke the paradigm of the parents are dead, and now our heroes have to go about their lives. Maybe they're inspired by the death. The fact that he had to take care of her is such a big part of the mythology to me.
So true. Who would Peter be without his Aunt May? Tom, what about you?
To me, particularly the early Spider-Man stories are the ones that really made me connect with the character. I grew up in the 70s, and in the 70s, Spider-Man was ubiquitous. He was kind of everywhere. The 67 cartoons ran on in afternoons all the time, and he was on the Electric Company and so forth. But it wasn't really until I read those early stories that I connected with the character. And it all kind of boils down to what is, I think, the essence of what makes Spider-Man work is Spider-Man was the first superhero who was the audience, that all the superheroes up to that point were, as Jam said earlier, these fairly aspirational, finely chiseled, full-grown, upstanding citizens. And Peter Parker was just this stupid kid trying to make something good out of this weird accident that happened to him, and often lousing up in the way he did it, and it not being, just a blessing or a boon to him, or the thing that puts him over the top and makes everybody love him. but in fact that complicates his life and makes it more difficult. And speaking personally, I think it's no secret that if you gave me superpowers, I would be awful with them. I would just be bad at it. And Spider-Man was often bad at it, and that I think was very relatable.
I can greatly appreciate that in my heart. Now, Tom, as our resident know-it-all, you tend to just know all the things about comic history. I know whenever we have somewhere we need some help, we always turn to you. Could you lay a little context for us about sort of the landscape of comics before Spider-Man came into them, and what Steve Ditko and Stan Lee really did by introducing this character?
Tell us about the 50s and 60s, Tom.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Well, like we said earlier, in the world of 1962, by and large, superhero comics were fairly simple things, particularly after the rise of the Comics Code. Even seeing one superhero punch another guy's punch a villain was not done all that much. Most of the stories were sort of puzzle based. There'd be a challenge, there'd be a mystery, there'd be a question, there'd be a secret. There was a lot of running around, maintaining your secret identity, and not really doing a heck of a lot much more beyond that. And all of the characters, they were adults, they were beloved, and they were fairly thin as individuals. It's not like there was not any personality to a superhero's real identity or civilian identity, but there wasn't a whole lot. What Spider-Man did, and while there's a precedence for it in Fantastic Four, which came a little bit earlier, what Spider-Man really did better and more effectively than any other series of the time, and impacted and affected like everything that came after, was the story is not about Spider-Man. The story is about Peter Parker. And Peter Parker, the individual, is more important and is the focus of everything more than the superheroics. The civilian identity wasn't just something to set a character up in a place where he put on his costume and the rest of the story is about him battling whatever. You'd go through in issues of Spider-Man, early issues particularly, and Peter Parker would just be Peter Parker for like half the comic book. And that was seen as crazy. Like, no kid's going to want to read about this guy, doing his laundry and being bothered by his bully and trying to scrape 2 nickels together to make the rent or whatever. But that was all the stuff that made people interested and care about Spider-Man and his problems and his struggles, and made him feel like much more of a real person than any superhero had been up to that point.
Well, I definitely think that we all feel a real kindredness with Peter Parker in particular, just as a person. And, JM, you probably know him better than anyone, as you spent so much time, writing Spider-Man, in the psyche of Spider-Man. What early stories really inspired your runs and your work with Spider-Man? And what is it like inside that head of his?
It's interesting. I was saying to somebody that I know Peter Parker and Ben Reilly better than I know some of my best friends, because I have lived inside their heads and I know every little demon that's crawling around in their psyches. My friends don't let me do that, So, at first as a reader and then as a writer, I've lived with this character my entire life. And I always say that, to follow up on what Tom said, these stories are always about Peter Parker, mask on or mask off. They're not Spider-Man stories. They're Peter Parker stories. And Peter, to me, in terms of mainstream comics, is the most psychologically real character that's ever emerged from mainstream comics. He doesn't put on a mask and become something other. He's always Peter. And another thing, to go back to what we talked about before, he was a working class kid too. As a working class kid from Brooklyn, I really related to that. He wasn't some rich guy, or he was just a kid whose family was struggling, and all these things. If you talk to any Spider-Man writer, I don't care what their ethnicity is, what their religion, what their background, we all feel like he's us, and it's a very unique thing for a character to be able to be that relatable to so many different people. If that answered your question, I don't know.
No, yes, it did. Thank you. Well, and it reminds me, he does have all of these troubles. He experiences death in his very first issue in Amazing Fantasy 15. But we also fall in love with him because he has this fabulous sense of humor, and he's got jokes, he's got the fun, witty comebacks. And I'm curious for you, Steve. You spent a lot of time with Spidey as well.
Why don't you develop that in yourself, Steve?
Well, Steve is, as we know, Steve is my comedy guy. But why do you think that's so important that both comedy and tragedy are such really important parts of Spider-Man?
Well, I guess comedy is the way we deal with tragedy. There's tragedy all around us every day. Tragedy happens no matter what. So you need the comedy to deal with it. I do think it was a key part of the character. One of the striking things about Spidey is that right away he is, as a superhero, more than any other hero until him, he is just super ostentatious and annoying and will land some decent jokes. It was, those early stories, I think it's the first issue where he meets the Fantastic Four and he just bugs the hell out of Ben Grimm. To the point where like Ben Grimm's destroying the Baxter building because he's so annoyed by Spider-Man. He just brings it out of people. Certainly is a trait Tom can recognize. But it is something I think that set him apart and is key to the character's longevity. If a writer can get on that book and actually land some solid jokes like Mr. DeMatteis did for a long time, it sort of elevates.
In Craven's Last Hunt, that hilarious story.
Hysterical. I read it with a laugh track. There's more to you than Craven's Last Hunt, my friend. I'm thinking Frogman and White Rabbit for one, among many others. But the ability to come in and have a character like that is rare, and I think that's why it's attracted so much talent through the years.
I definitely think that everyone who gets an opportunity to work on Spider-Man feels like it is the biggest feather in their cap from everything that I've seen because he is such a beloved character. Now we have some fan questions here from our friends that are watching here right now. We have this one from Patrick in Canada for JM. Spectacular Spider-Man 200 is my favorite Spider-Man comic. When you kill a major character, what's that?
That's a good comic.
It is.
He's right.
When you kill a major character like Harry Osborn, do you need permission from the other Spidey writers, or can you just kill him and the other writers go, "Oh, I guess he's dead now"?
You need you have to clear these things with every other writer, but you certainly need the permission of your editor. In most cases, and I've killed off a few of these characters along the way. And it's just you don't even plan. It's not like you sit down. I didn't sit down 2 years before that when I launched that story and say I'm going to kill Harry. It was a natural evolution of the story, and my editor Danny Fingeroth understood that. The one time we had to really go up above was when it was time to kill Aunt May, and we had to get Stan's permission on that one because we couldn't do that without Stan's permission. But usually it's just between you and your editor, and if the other writers have complaints, they don't complain to me, they complain to the editor.
So that's these guys' problem. All right, we got it.
That's right.
All right, we've got, actually, I wanted to ask, along those lines, Jam, you're a very humble man, but Tom and Steve, what are your favorite runs of Mr. DeMatteis here? What are your favorite stories that he's worked on?
Well, I think that the sequence that we just talked about, that whole Harry Osborn is the Goblin sequence that he did with Sal Buscema in Spectacular Spider-Man from, I guess it was in like the 170s, 180s, all the way up to 200. All of that material is really great and really strong. Everybody on Earth will talk about Craven's Last Hunt, and deservedly so. But there was a lot more that Mark did on Spider-Man than that. Certainly, again, it's an era that's controversial. But during the days of the Clone Saga, I feel like he wrote the Spider-Man stories both the Peter Parker stories and the Ben Reilly stories, in particular, in fleshing out the background of Ben Reilly, the lost years and the Spider-Man redemptions, that really gave that character depth and soul, where he could have just been an empty suit of tights and nobody would have cared about him. So that's an area that maybe and obviously now you're back, you're doing more stuff with Ben Reilly today, and it's kind of nice.
Tom, you're answering every run. You're not leaving anything for me.
Yes,
We're just going to talk about Frogman anyway, Steve. So what's the difference?
That's true.
yeah,
I was.
I left.
Thank you, Tom, by the way. Thank you.
The Craven's Last Hunt, I think, is one of Marvel's perennials. It's one of the stories that everyone should read. It gets to the core of a couple different characters in a strong way. I don't know how it's not a movie yet, or a game, or a novel. I think it's a perfect comic. I'm more struck with that one by the timing of it, because it comes right on the heels of The Wedding. And as someone who was, I mean, if you're reading Spidey at the time, The Wedding alone was already came not completely out of the blue, but there wasn't a ton of lead up to it. And then the fact that story hits, I want to say, the month after, and then right into Mad Dog War after that, it is a heck of a summer for Spider-Man comics.
Yeah, and a good job too of without demeaning the people that came before. Craven was just sort of he was a second string or third string Spider-Man villain. He'd been in a bunch of stories and the stories were fine, but nobody particularly cared about Craven one way or the other until you got to Craven's Last Hunt. And then he was dead and nobody could use him again, but everybody wanted to, because there suddenly was all this unforeseen, depth and internal life to this character that hadn't been explored, in the stuff that had come before. He was just a weirdo with a lion on his vest.
And the writing is just so precise and succinct, and it feels poetic. It feels like Walt Whitman's writing Spider-Man for 6 issues. It's really a great comic.
I got to send you both checks after this conversation.
All right. Well, I know I'm a huge fan. Thank you, I have to say, because I've read so many things of yours that I feel like have really hurt in the right way, where you're so caught up in the story that you're like, oh, my heart. So thank you for that. We're about to wrap up, but I want to throw some rapid fire questions at all of you to just give me a super quick answer, one word or one phrase, whatever comes to your mind first. All right.
Antelope.
Not yet, Tom. Not yet. Most sinister Spider-Man villain.
Oh,
Green Goblin. Green Goblin.
Depends which Green Goblin, doesn't it? The original
billing
Green Goblin. I'll go with the
department of
original
Forest
Green
Hills
Goblin because he
Hospital.
was creepy.
And Steve,
Yep,
what was yours?
The billing department of Forest Hills Hospital.
That might actually be the real answer. Greatest Spidey love interest. Tom, why don't you start us?
Gwen Stacy.
Jam?
Mary Jane.
Steve?
Carly Cooper.
Wow. Across the board. All right. Spider-Man in one word. Tom?
Gotta be amazing, right?
Steve?
Oh yeah, that's a good one. Everyman.
JM?
Human.
Also,
Indeed.
Schlemiel works.
It does. It does. Thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. Thank you, Tom, Steve, and JM, for chatting with us about Spider-Man's origins.